For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on!
Alright guys, welcome back. Today we are going to read chapter 23, The Pepper Plums. Just a mile outside of Murmansky, Russia, was a little shabby home called The Dwelling. The floors were uneven, the chimney built crooked, and the roof was infested with holes, which was why, during the rainy season, there were at least a dozen buckets stationed throughout. It was a small home on a big property. It rested on a lot of 4 acres, including a barn in the back, a fenced yard for the horses, and a small thicket of private wood where the Kola River runs directly through. The dwelling had been in the Pepper Plum family for only 2 generations, starting with an elf by the name of Figgy Pepperplum and his lovely wife Penny. Penny was once a school teacher in CLAUS village who taught human anthropology to young, inspiring elves. Penny had been curious about humans for as long as she could remember. She believed that they should be studied, especially children, as they were the origin of all magic. She regarded human children as magical creatures in their own right and wished to study how they created magic without even knowing it, and how they lost the ability to do so once they reached adulthood. Her husband Figgy worked as a proud custodian for the Great Hall. It was an honored position in CLAUS village, as Figgy was responsible for records and scrolls dating as far back as 1,000 years. He was also in charge of the entire staff, delegating responsibilities, recruiting, and offering promotions when deserved. Figgy was an intelligent elf who was respected by many, and was even offered to become the new royal advisor to the current elven leader, but graciously declined after first speaking to his wife, of course. Mr. and Miss Pepperplum wanted above all else to become parents, to have little elfling children of their very own, and so they decided on quieter lives, which would have proven difficult in royal court. Months turned into years, and years became a full decade, but the Pepperplums were still without a child. It was on a December morning, just a few days before Christmas, when Penny was feeling particularly down. She was gazing out of their cottage window and into the village, surrounded by tall glaciers. She had a perfect view of the town square, the gigantic Great Hall with its enormous pillars situated in the backdrop. At first she smiled when she watched the little elven children playing in a frozen fountain. It was a magnificent granite sculpture of Saint Nikolai with water sprouting from his hands, frozen. But soon Penny's smile became a frown. Figgy walked into the kitchen to find his wife gazing hopelessly out of their cottage window with a heart aching for the child they never had. It was then when Figgy decided to surprise her with a trip. They left the North Pole the following day and traveled to Murmansky, Russia. Mr. and Miss Pepperplum left their troubles behind and ventured by ship to the mainland. They stayed in the Inkabad Inn, a little lodge above a lively tavern. They hiked, went sightseeing, and ate until their tummies could burst. It was on the last night, during an unexpected blizzard, when the couple decided to have dinner in the inn's downstairs tavern. The husband and wife enjoyed a plate of rubbed pork roast with a side of pickled cabbage when the inn's front door blew open. Out from the gust of wind and flurry of snow stumbled an old, haggard witch. Aside from the Pepperplums, all the guests dining in the tavern were human, the chef, the waiter, and the manager of both the inn and tavern. None of them could have known that the stranger was a witch, but the Pepperplums did. There were telling signs. She wore a long, black-colored cloak with a tall, pointy hat, and had a warty face with a crooked nose. The most obvious was the hilt of her wand sticking out of her cloak pocket. The witch was making a stir, screeching for a waiter, bumping its tables, taking a swig from a man's pint while being escorted to her table. That's when she spotted Mr. and Miss Pepperplum. Right away she noticed Figgy's long pointy ears poking the top of his cap. She then became aware of Penny, who had a scarf wrapped snugly around her head and chin, with her lengthy ears slightly noticeable through the thin silk fabric. Instantly the witch knew they were elves. She asked to join them, and the Pepperplums, known for their friendliness, allowed her to. The old witch bought them all their first round, Figgy a pint of ale, Penny a glass of bubbly champagne, and herself a shot of whiskey. saying the liquor was good to calm her nerves. They shared stories, got acquainted, with Figgy buying them all a second round. The night went on, and their faces burned red, and they all laughed so hard they hiccuped, and that's when the witch asked the pepper plums for help. She shared with them that she belonged to a coven of dark witches, monsters called the Enchanted Sisters of Grimlock Grove. Their coven queen, while leading a recent seance, unexpectedly foretold a prophecy. She spoke of a child who would soon be born that would restore joy into the world by putting an end to monsters forever. Scrying with her magic mirror, the coven queen sought to find this baby and kill it. The pepper plums gasped, but the witch, who called herself Befana, shared with them that though she had been known to frighten children and even feed on their fears, killing a baby was not in her nature. So Befana fled the coven in the dead of night and took to her broom, soaring through a cloudy sky. She soon found the baby in Murmansky, Russia. The coven queen had already beat her there, and 2 young parents lay dead in the living room. After battling the coven queen with spurting spells and imaginative curses, Befana fled up the stairs and into a bedroom, finding a beautiful baby girl nestled in a crib. She took the baby and ran, and now Befana is here, in the tavern below the Ichabod Inn. She opened her cloak, revealing a sleeping baby in her arms. Befana begged Mr. and Miss Pepperplum to care for the child and to raise her as their own. Figgy and Penny deliberated, but ultimately agreed, seeing as they had always dreamt of a child of their very own. Befana fled Murmansky that night. She journeyed far from her coven, from country to country, until she found an abandoned cabin somewhere lost in Dunder Woods. There she would spend many decades after. As for the Pepperplums, Figgy and Penny knew they could never return to CLAUS village with a human baby, and so they vowed to never return. The Pepperplums went a mile outside of the city and built their little shabby home on 4 acres of land. There they would raise their little human girl, whom they named Aurora, after the Aurora Borealis lights, a spectacular display of mystical lights that appear every night waving in the sky above their quaint little home. For the rest of their lives, Figgy and Penny lived in the dwelling and raised their human girl, watching her flourish into a beautiful young lady of who they couldn't have been more proud of. Years later, they were blessed with 2 boys. Babbleton was Mr. and Miss Pepperplum's second child, who would one day return to his parents' cottage in CLAUS village and work for some years as the village mechanic. He would later fall in love with a free-spirited young elf fond of the art of glass blowing. The 2 married and would soon open up their own shop in the village square called Pepperplum Sparkles and Shines, selling artsy molded glass. The Pepperplum's youngest child, Cupid, was an extraordinarily attractive boy. He spent a lot of his time fishing and hunting and made most of his income by entering dog sled competitions across all of Northern Europe, where he usually came in first place. He never found a wife, but he wasn't looking for one either. He enjoyed spending his weekends with his human friends, hopping from pub to tavern, using his charm and charisma to sweep young fair ladies off their feet. Whether they were human or elf, it didn't matter. Young handsome Cupid would later take over the dwelling after the death of their parents, who, unfortunately, perished months apart from each other. Penny died from an unexpected surge of Grimace disease, and Figgy, who was hopeless without his wife, had a fatal cooking accident. He tried to use magic, but it ended horribly. As for Aurora, well, that was something the family swore to keep a secret. That is, until now. It was a beautiful mid-afternoon, without a cloud in the sky. The dwelling sat lopsided in the snow beside the fenced-in horses, under the rarity of a warm sun. At first glance it looked like no one was home, but the more you looked, the more it was obvious that someone was. The curtains were drawn, but the chimney was smoking, and so the fireplace must have been going. There were loads of shoes along the front doormat, men's boots and women's heels, along with tiny children's shoes as well. There were also a whole lot of footprints in the snow, along with the smell of a recently baked ham wafting around. Someone was definitely home, but they most certainly didn't want anyone knowing it. All was calm and quiet on the dwelling property. A duck waddled onto a frozen pond, and the horses found strands of grass poking out of a sheet of snow, all while a mischievous red squirrel climbed up a pine and leapt onto the shack's hole-infested roof. Suddenly, a vortex appeared, spinning swirls of bright lights and vibrant colors, crackling loud enough to break the sound barrier. A dog sled team came barreling out of it, along with a crimson sleigh and 2 screaming children. The dogs landed gracefully in the dwelling's front yard, hauling the sleigh through the snow and up to the front door where the 8 Siberian Huskies and 1 terrier mutt lay down to rest. The vortex then sizzled out, vanishing for good. Cupid put down his reins. "Good work, guys," he applauded his team. "Now get some well-deserved rest." Nick and Emma crawled out from the back. Emma's hair had doubled in volume, while Nick's golden locks stuck to his sweaty face. Gilbert was tensely gripping onto Emma's shoulder, his tiny claws digging into her skin. His beady eyes refused to blink. Meanwhile, Comet leapt out of the sleigh and rolled in the snow, then pretended he was part of the dog sled team while prancing around in circles. Nick stumbled out of the sleigh, his knees dipping into the snow, then lifted back up all so he could fall back down again. "I don't like sleigh rides." His cheeks went puffy and his face green. He felt his stomach bubbling, and so he clamped a hand over his mouth. "I think I'm going to be sick." Emma eyed the ramshackle home, fearing the roof could collapse at any moment. She then turned to Cupid and asked, "Where exactly are we?" He unbuttoned his heavy jacket, revealing a remarkable definition of muscles. "Welcome to the dwelling," he gestured to the home with a pearly smile of perfectly straight teeth. "There are a lot of people in there looking forward to seeing you all." "We're expected?" asked Emma, surprised. Nick was on his knees, hunched over, arms wrapped around his midsection while holding back an upchuck. "Who's—" He clamped his hands over his mouth again and swallowed before heaving. "Who's expecting us?" Cupid brushed his luscious curls out from his eyes and said, "Go see for yourself." Nick started to feel better, and so he joined Emma and headed toward the home while Comet played outside with a terrier mutt named Coda. They were halfway to the home when the front door opened, and there stood 2 little elven girls. "Emma! Nick! Gilbert!" Olivia and Faye tore from the door frame and threw themselves outside. They hurried through the snowy yard and then right into Emma's arms. Emma was in such shock that she couldn't process it. She collapsed to her knees and squeezed the girls even harder. "What are you 2 doing here?" she cried, happy tears. I thought, oh, what's it matter? You're here." She then hugged them again. Gilbert jumped off Emma's shoulder and landed on Faye's head. He then scaled down her pointy ear onto her shoulder and then hugged her cold, plump cheek. The little elf giggled, then took the field mouse in her hands and kissed him on the head. "I don't understand," stated Nick. "I don't understand," started Nick, smiling and laughing with the rest of them. "What are you 2 doing here? Come on, we'll show you." Olivia took Emma's hand, and Faye took Nick's, and together, the young elves led them into the home with Cupid trailing behind. The inside of the dwelling was easily imagined. There were a few holes in the ceiling, the floor was all warped, and the furniture throughout was ages old, as they were originally purchased by Figgy and Penny Pepperplum shortly after building the house all those years ago. But none of this mattered, because the home was filled with many recognizable faces. Miss Pransley stood in the kitchen, ignoring the mice foraging the cupboards, as she sprinkled powdered sugar on a loaf of jewel cake she had just baked. Waiting for the jewel cake was a balding man with large callous hands sitting at the lopsided dining room table while in a heavy conversation with none other than Mr. McTwizzle himself. The toy maker's face revealed he had endured quite the brawl. He had healing cuts and dark purple bruises, but his smile remained just as bright. Knitting in the living room was Bafana. She was poised on the couch with a pair of fat, hairy feet planted on the coffee table, where a lazy cat by the name of Bartholomew sat sleeping. "Oh, good! You've all made it." Miss Pransley brought the Norwegian Christmas cake over to the table while 11 porcelain dishes drifted alongside her, then scattered accordingly around the long table by further flicks of Miss Pransley's wrist. "Nick, Emma, Gilbert, I would like for you all to meet my husband, Mr. Pransley." She gestured to the balding man while dividing the fruitcake. "Good to finally meet you all," he said. Nick was confused, but not enough to forget his manners. "Yes, you as well." Miss Pransley dropped a plate of cake in front of the toy maker. "Homemade jeweled cake, what a treat!" Mr. McTwizzle giddied while tucking a cloth napkin under his chin. "I do love candied fruit much more than traditional fruit. It's the only way I can eat it, actually. He rubbed his hands together, smiling with a cut lip. He then picked up his fork and tucked it in. Believe it or not, this is my first taste of jewel cake this Christmas season. I usually get it from a lovely bakery down the street from where my shop is located back in New York City. It was called the Little Gingerbread House of Sweets. Emma felt an extra skip in her heart. That's my mom's bakery. I know, Mr. McTwizzle acknowledged. I used to visit her bakery every morning before work. She was such a lovely woman, always greeting me with a warm smile. She made some of the best jewel cakes I've ever tasted, but it was her almond cookies that were simply out of this world. Cinnamon, said Emma proudly. Her trick was cinnamon. She added a dash to each batch. She smiled when she remembered. She called it her secret sauce. She giggled faintly, but it was only cinnamon. Mr. McTwizzle pinched his lips, his smile fading along with the twinkle that usually sparkled through his half-moon glasses. I was sorry to hear of her passing. I do hope to see that bakery open up again one day. Emma forced a grin, but it wasn't much of one. Her mother was gone, and the bakery closed, and she was now an orphan where opening up a bakery was too big of a dream to have. Miss Pransley, dear, Mafana pulled out a chair at the table with a twirl of her wand. Could I trouble you for some hot cocoa? She didn't wait for a response. Do add some goblin rock salt if you have any. Of course. Miss Pransley had hot cocoa already boiling on the stove. She reached into a high cupboard for the salt and then sprinkled in a generous amount. She then stirred the bubbling cocoa with a ladle, took a sip, tasted pork dumplings, her favorite food, and then deemed it ready, and then proceeded to serve everyone at the table. Miss Pransley was pouring Bafana a cup when she noticed Nick and Emma standing there, looking puzzled. Everything all right? Nick swept his confused gaze across the crowded table. All these old friends gathered around, enjoying a slice of jewel cake along with a cup of hot cocoa. Bafana sat at the head of the table. Mr. McTwizzle and Mr. Pransley sat situated beside each other. Olivia and Faye sat with Gilbert, making a mess as they ate and drank, the field mouse included. And then there was Cupid, adding marshmallows into his drink, next to Bartholomew, lazily picking at his piece of Christmas cake. The more Nick looked around, the more his head spun. What's going on, he asked. Yes, Emma agreed. It's not that we aren't excited to see you, but what are you all doing here? Miss Pransley wiped her hands dry on the kitchen towel hanging off her apron pocket. Olivia, Faye, she spotted her children at the table. Upstairs, please. But we aren't finished yet, Olivia complained after taking another bite. Take it upstairs, now, Miss Pransley insisted. The girls pouted, and then they vanished. Moments later, they could be heard squeaking the floorboards above the table. Gilbert continued sipping his hot cocoa by hanging off his mug. He was uninterested in anything else going on around him. His hot cocoa didn't have any cheese in it, but the goblin rock salt did give off the taste of cheddar, and so Gilbert was more focused on his drink than anything else. Bartholomew, however, grew bored and very sleepy. After all, it was getting close to the end of December, only days before Yule cats go back into hibernation, and so it was understandable why Bartholomew was so tired. He leapt from his chair, trotting off into the living room where he plopped down on the couch. Nick repeated himself. What's going on? Sit, offered Mr. McTwizzle, gesturing to the pair of empty chairs situated directly in front of the teenagers. Nick and Emma hesitated, but ultimately fell into their seats. It's time, Nick. It's time for you to learn who you really are. Who am I? We all hoped you would come to discover it for yourself, but I'm afraid time is running out, said Miss Pransley. What do you mean by that? Asked Emma, looking from Nick's bewildered expression to the faces of all the adults looking back at them. What's this all about? Nick, do you still have the snow globe Sister Merryweather gave you? Their toy maker inquired. Nick reached into Gilbert's satchel and drew out the glass orb, swirling with snow. He handed it off to Mr. McTwizzle, who gave it a shake, and then placed it down on the table, commanding all attention. Roughly 40 years ago, a witch coven called the Enchanted Sisters of Grimlock Grove stumbled upon a prophecy which was foretold by their coven queen. He explained, hoping to clarify. Nearly all witches are evil, and so the prophecy was dangerous in the hands of such creatures. Bafana was obviously accustomed to witch culture, and so she chimed in to help enlighten the children. Foretelling the future is an evolutionary trait of witches, developed by our sisters of old who were hunted and burned. To prophesize what is to come became a necessity to our species' survival, a sacred art found in any witch of modern day, but only the strongest can unleash it, the Coven Queen being as such. Emma glanced at Nick, still just as confused as ever. And then she looked back at Mr. McTwizzle. What exactly did this prophecy say? He spun the snow globe around, revealing the silver plate etched with an inscription. He recited, "From two worlds a child will be born, with a spark in their heart that shines brighter than all. To those who dwell in the dark, beware, I warn. If this child fights, then you shall fall." Befana picked up the story where the toy maker left it. The Coven Queen felt threatened, and her judgment clouded. She should have taken extra precaution, but recklessly didn't. She immediately fled to her magic mirror and scried for the child. By doing this, she, let us say, jumped the gun. Befana took a sip of cocoa between her words. You see, magic isn't perfect. It doesn't always get everything right. It tries, and the harder it does, the more unstable and unpredictable it becomes. The same as when someone tries breaking one of the 3 rules of magic. It can also at times be unclear, and that is exactly what happened to the Coven Queen. She asked her mirror to find the child spoken in the prophecy, and the mirror revealed to her a baby, human girl. Nick and Emma shared a look, the two of them equally lost. The Coven Queen, continued Befana, traveled to Murmansky, Russia, broke into a cottage in the city and murdered a young couple. She tried to steal the baby, but I was able to rescue her. I entrusted that baby with an elf couple, the Pepperplums, who had raised the baby in this very home. They named her Aurora, and Figgy and Penny Pepperplum loved her as though she were their own. They would have 2 boys years later, one of whom was so gracious to offer us their home as a hideout. Befana gestured to Cupid, sipping his cocoa, leaving him with a chocolate mustache that only made him look more endearing. Nick directed his attention back to Befana. What does this have anything to do with us? The Coven Queen made a mistake, Mr. McTwizzle answered for her. The prophecy she foretold wasn't speaking of Aurora, but a child who hadn't yet been born. When the Coven Queen scried for the child, she located Aurora only because Aurora would one day become the mother of the child spoken in the prophecy. He met eyes with Nick and finished gravely, "You, Nick, you are Aurora's son." His voice shivered. What? Emma reached under the table and took his hand, but he couldn't feel it. He couldn't feel anything. Not the draft in the shack, or the heat from Emma's hand, nothing. He felt thrown into his thoughts, lost in the dark, spiraling into the depths. It's true, Nick. Mr. McTwizzle pulled all eyes back on him. Your mother was a girl thrown unjustly into a world she didn't belong. She was human, yes, but raised by elves, and what a fantastic job the Pepperplums did. Your mother was remarkable. Nick tried to follow along to the best of his ability, but there were so many thoughts spinning in his head, and so many feelings in his heart, making it near impossible to catch every word the toy maker was saying. Aurora went to school with all the other human children, and when she got home, her mother, a retired school teacher from CLAUS village, taught her all about the secret world of magical creatures. All her life she was engrossed in magic, always dreaming to visit the village her parents had once lived. She was my big sister, said Cupid, heartbroken. She was always going on about the North Pole, and how very much she wanted to visit CLAUS village, to meet all the elves, to learn more about magic, and when she was 18 years old she finally got the chance to. My mom, the word sat heavy in Nick's mouth, as it was a word he had never spoken out loud before. Went to the North Pole? She did, answered Mr. McTwizzle, and it was there where she fell in love with an elf by the name of Nicholas. Nick scooted out of his chair, backing away from the table until he was stopped by a wall. He kept shaking his head, refusing to believe it, to even try to comprehend it. It was too much. It was all too much. He knew where the story was headed. He could feel it in his bones. He knew that hearing the truth would change his life forever, and that was a commitment he just wasn't ready for. All eyes were on him. The witch, the toy maker, the Pransleys, Cupid, Emma, and even Gilbert started to follow along. Mr. McTwizzle pressed on. At the time Aurora traveled to CLAUS village, Saint Nicholas was the ruler of elven kind. He was a kind, honorable elf who ruled the North Pole with grace and dignity, and who wielded the northern staff to banish more monsters behind the gates of Twilight Bridge than any leader had ever done before. He was a warrior who believed that elves were put on this earth to protect the children of the world by vanquishing monsters and prevailing darkness. Mr. McTwizzle tried to go as slow as he could to allow Nick the time to soak it all in. but Nick only gazed back at the toy maker with a blank stare. St. Nicholas, he continued, had just returned home to the North Pole after battling a terrifying beast called a Persolici, who had been terrorizing Romanian children in the villages near the Transylvania Alps. He arrived home to cheers and celebrations, and a parade running through the streets of CLAUS village. That's where he met your mother. The two would soon be married, the first human and elf matrimony in magical history. 7 years later, they would have a baby, a boy from the Coven Queen's prophecy, one born from 2 worlds. That can't be right, Nick refused. I'm not an elf. I'm just a boy. A human boy. He reached for his ears, feeling how round and not pointy they were. Just look at my ears. You're both, corrected Cupid. Your mom was my sister, and so I knew her well. He held back a chuckle. You seem to have inherited her funny-looking ears. Something dark suddenly dawned on Nick. If my parents really are St. Nicholas and Aurora, then how did I end up an orphan all the way across the world? All of the adults exchanged a look, and then decided on Mr. McTwizzle to share. I was there that night. His words threw them all into the past. You were just a baby, only a few days old, when Avalmark broke into CLAUS village and into the great hall where your family lived. He murdered his brother, your father, all for the northern staff. Fortunately, Aurora had taken you to see me that night. She had come to my toy shop to ask me to make you a special gift. Somehow Nick remembered. The snow globe. The toy maker nodded and then continued. We went over the details, and just when we had it all sorted out, we heard an explosion from the great hall. Your mother and I ran to the window, catching black smoke tumbling out of one of the great hall's windows. Soon the streets of CLAUS village filled with elves, crying and screaming while Avalmark's goons raged an attack of dark magic. Aurora insisted to go after your father to ensure he was alright, even though I begged her not to. What happened to Nick? Asked Emma. Aurora trusted me with him. She put him in my arms and told me to take him somewhere safe. The twinkle in Mr. McTwizzle's eyes dimmed and then vanished completely. His long face left somber. Those were the last words she ever spoke to me, putting her faith in me to protect her baby. He used a knuckle to stop a tear from cascading down his cheek. That night, magic was weak, he continued despite the toll of emotion. Elves could already feel the difference in the air now that St. Nicholas was gone. I hadn't even the strength to fizzle out of there, and so I fled. I took Nick, just a bundle in my arms, down into the secret tunnels. I was led to a ship, and I began a long journey to New York City. Nick cried, Where you left me on the doorstep of an orphanage. Tears came streaking down his face. No explanation, no nothing, just left to be raised by strangers. Mr. McTwizzle shook his head with sympathy in his eyes. My boy, I didn't leave you with strangers. He took a deep breath and then exhaled. I left you with your aunt. Time stopped, and silence left a stillness in the air. Nick shivered. What did you say? Your father wasn't an only child. Mr. McTwizzle deepened his explanation. You know Avalmark was his younger brother, but what you don't know is that he had a younger sister as well, and her name was Merryweather. Nick's head was so noisy. His mind fractured with all of the conversations he'd ever had with Sister Merryweather. They all went off in his head simultaneously. Most of them he hadn't remembered before then. 15 years, he thought while his chin vibrated. 15 years she had to tell him who he was and who she was to him. But she left him alone in the dark. All that time wasted. My true family was there at Lost Star Orphanage all along. He felt betrayed by Sister Merryweather. She could have spared him so much grief, but chose otherwise. How could you? Nick's eyes swept the table. Any of you could have told me, but didn't. His eyes burned. All this time I thought I was just an orphan. He took a deep breath. And that my parents didn't want me. He looked at each of them with a pair of red eyes. How could you keep that from me? Mr. McTwizzle spoke gently. My dear boy, no one wanted to keep it from you. We did so only to protect you. Miss Prancy joined in with a heartfelt tone. Nick, there wasn't anyone who wanted you to live in an orphanage. Nearly any elf in the world would have taken you in, but Avalmark was after you. Cupid downed the rest of his hot cocoa and then added, After Avalmark murdered your father, he claimed the northern staff, but it was without a stone. The staff is nothing without it. For some reason, kid, Avalmark believes you have it, said Mr. Pransley. a quiet yet observant elf. Befana began, Alvamark wants the stone, but more importantly, he wants you dead. Only an heir of Saint Nikolai may wield the staff, and you are the true heir. He wants the stone so that he can destroy you and any lasting hope there is with you. It came back around the table to Mr. McTwizzle. If Alvamark gets the stone and unites it with the Northern Staff, he will open the gates of Twilight Bridge and release hordes of monsters back into the world. He stressed his words. Nick, you understand what we're trying to tell you, don't you? You are the true heir, a descendant of Saint Nikolai, a rightful wielder of the Northern Staff. You, my boy, are the ruler of elven kind. It was all just more noise in Nick's head. It was never about saving the orphans, at least not entirely. It's always been about you defeating Lord Alvamark and claiming the Northern Staff as your own. Nick, it's time for you to fight. He shook his head, refusing all of it. His mother being raised by elves, his father ruler of elven kind, Sister Meriwether's secret, who he was, who they were asking him to be. He just couldn't. The tears in his eyes felt like they were boiling. He tore from the wall, swung the front door open, and ran into the snowy yard crying. Nick, Emma shouted, but was ignored. Nick ran through the yard, passing Comet and Coda wrestling in the snow. His tears were blurring his vision while he sprinted alongside the fenced-in horses, and even more when he worked his way past the barn in the back. All these voices in his head felt like they were screaming at him. He gripped his skull, silently screaming to drown out the voices, squeezing down hard, all while ducking through the trees into the snow-veiled wood. He swatted branches, stabbed by thorns. He didn't care. He pushed himself further, deeper into the wild thicket, not stopping until he fell to his knees at a rapid flowing river. He slouched forward, his face buried in his lap, sobbing more tears than he even knew he had. Finally, after all this time, he knew who his parents were. He just couldn't understand why that made him feel more like an orphan than ever before. Nick cried, his tears surging free. It was too much, he thought. How was he, a 15-year-old orphan from New York City, expected to fight a demonic elf who murdered his parents? He didn't even know how to fight, and had no interest in learning to either. He was just Nick. Kind, loving Nick. He liked to cook and build dollhouses, and actually enjoyed working on his homework. What he certainly didn't like was the idea of fighting his uncle so that he doesn't unleash a bunch of monsters into the world. He also didn't like the idea of being a ruler, especially to elves. No, this can't be right. They must have gotten the wrong Nick. A soft grunt broke the silence. Nick rolled around with the tear-stained cheeks to find a baby reindeer strolling out from a grove of aspens. Comet, he sniffled, then dried his eyes off on his sleeve. Hey, little buddy. The calf's hooves went clicking in the snow as it pranced over to Nick and bumped him gently with his head. Nick patted him, running his hand through his soft fur. Comet, I'm not who they think I am. I can't be, he insisted. I can't fight monsters or rule a magical species or even do magic, which, by the way, I still don't even trust. I'm just an orphan. Comet didn't seem to like the sound of that, and so he snorted with blue eyes narrowing at Nick. What? That's what I am. It's what I've always been. Comet shook his head with an angry face that was actually quite cute and made Nick almost giggle. You don't think so? The calf shook his head again. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's true. Nick drew his knees up to his chest and wrapped his arms tightly around them. All I want is to be back in my bed in Lost Star Orphanage, throw my blanket over my head, and pretend magic never existed. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed it. Come back tomorrow for chapter 24, Into Darkness.